Okay, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me today to talk about my findings. Can everybody see the screen correctly? Great, thank you. So as you can see here in this slide, today I will be talking about how 280 millimeter cannon called Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket came to Korea. I believe I was allotted 45 minutes, so I'm going to time myself so I don't go overboard. So this is what happened. In late January 1958, two nuclear-capable weapons, one 280 millimeter cannon called Atomic Annie, which is a big gun that you see here, and Honest John rocket, which is what you see here, something that looks like a missile. These two weapon systems were brought into Korea. And that's the American newspaper. I have two questions. Why were these two particular weapons chosen over other weapons? You might already know this, but the United States at the time had a range of different nuclear-capable weapons. But why did it have to be Atomic Annie, and why did it have to be Honest John rocket? My second question is, why were they introduced in January 1958, not earlier or later? The reason why I brought these questions up is because existing studies do not really sufficiently answer these. I thought it would be important to answer these questions, especially because, as you might already know, there's been an ongoing discussion about whether or not South Korea should develop its nuclear weapons or whether or not the United States should redeploy its tactical nuclear weapons to Korea. So let me briefly talk about what these weapons are. 280 millimeter cannon, or Atomic Annie, is, again, it's a giant gun, as you can see in the pictures here. It had a very limited range of 30 kilometers, but it was very powerful, almost similar to the bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It had a yield of approximately 20 kilotons. Honest John rocket, as you can see here in the picture, it's what looks like a missile. It also had a limited range of maximum 40 kilometers with a yield of approximately 20 kilotons. So just as powerful as the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I kept saying limited range, and it might be a little difficult to visualize this, so let me put it this way. The distance between the border between South Korea and North Korea, distance between the border and Pyongyang, North Korean's capital, is a little over 100 kilometers. As I mentioned earlier, the maximum range of Atomic Annie and Honest John rockets were 40 kilometers. So even if you place these weapons at the tip of the border, it's not going to reach Pyongyang, it's not going to reach China or Russia. It's only useful as battlefield weapons. It could be used within Korea only. And as I mentioned earlier, the United States had a range of different nuclear weapons, but these specific warheads would be used for Atomic Annie and Honest John. So again, the question is, why did it have to be Atomic Annie and Honest John and not something else? Atomic Annie and Honest John were US Army's weapons. Why did it have to be US Army's weapons and not United States Air Force's weapon? These were tactical nuclear weapons, not strategic nuclear weapons. Why not strategic weapons? They also had limited range and relatively low yield. Some nuclear weapons had a yield of megatons. Compared to that, these were very weak weapons comparatively. So why not something that was more powerful, greater in range? Why did it have to be these two weapons? And my second question, why January 1958? As you can see here, Atomic Annie and Honest John were already deployed to West Germany in April and May 1955. In the case of Italy, Honest John was deployed in August 1956. In contrast, in the case of Korea, they were only brought in January 1958. So how do you explain this delay? That's my second question. Let me just start with the conclusion. Why Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket? Well, because they were appropriate for Korea. And why January 1958? Number one, because the United States had to iron out its own differences. And number two, the United States had to sort things out with South Korea. And both of these took time. So let me elaborate. Question number one, why Atomic Annie and Honest John rockets? I think it's useful to go over how United States nuclear weapons employment strategy evolved. This is conventional understanding, so I will go over it very quickly. So during Eisenhower administration, the United States started with the doctrine of massive retaliation. It began to slowly move away from it. And by Kennedy administration, you have this thing called flexible response, which is basically having two options. You can either use nuclear weapons, but you can also use conventional force. Whereas massive retaliation is you just start with nuclear weapons as soon as you have a war. So here's a brief outline of how the United States nuclear weapons employment strategy evolved over the years. I will talk about this more in detail in just a sec, but here I just wanted to highlight four things. So the United States started with no nuclear weapon strategy. They did use nuclear weapons in 1945, but there was no national level nuclear weapons employment strategy. They will only have a national nuclear weapons employment strategy in 1953 with the adoption of NSC 162/2. This would later evolve with NSC 5501, which said that tactical nuclear weapons will be used in local situations. And by 1956, with the adoption of NSC 5602/1, you have this idea that, yes, tactical nuclear weapons can be used on the condition that this did not develop into a general war with the Soviet bloc. So let me elaborate. As I mentioned earlier, in August 1945, the United States dropped 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but there were no nuclear weapons employment strategy. And it would take years before they would actually come up with something that would resemble a strategy. The first significant development was NSC 30, which was adopted during Truman administration on 10 September 1948. I will talk more about this in just a sec. And then again, the true national level U.S. nuclear weapons employment strategy would be adopted in October 1953 with the adoption of NSC 162/2. Now, I kept saying that there was no national level strategy, but I think it is important that to remember that the US military had already been adopting the idea of using nuclear weapons in their war plans since 1946. So what you see here, this map is from this document called JWPC 476/1, or as what is conventionally called Moonrise. It's one of the war plans developed by the United States military. It was written on June 16, 1947. As you can see here, you see industrial military targets within the Soviet Union. The idea was that the United States, if it ever got into a war with the Soviet Union, they would send strategic bombers and drop strategic nuclear bombs on these targets. Now, this is another document, JSPC 496/1, or what is called a broiler. It's another war plan that was more refined with more details. It was developed in early 1948, and it said that the United States would use nuclear weapons during early phase of the war through air offensive using Air Force strategic bombers to destroy Soviet war effort and achieve maximum psychological effect. Now, as mentioned earlier, there was a prototype U.S. national nuclear weapons employment strategy by 1948. NSC 30 was adopted on 10 September 1948, and it was not exactly a strategy, but it outlined two very important principles that are still valid. One of which was that nuclear weapons might be used in the case of a war. Second one, only the president gets to decide whether or not to use nuclear weapons. And again, with the adoption of NSC 162/2 in 1953, you have the first and genuine US national level nuclear weapons employment strategy. And it basically says that in order to deter or respond to Soviet threat, the United States would use this thing called massive retaliation, using strategic bombers and strategic nuclear bombs. Now, the reason why I bring this up is to show you what did not contribute to the deployment of nuclear-capable weapons to Korea. At least in the case of South Korea, there's a little bit of misunderstanding. Some people think that nuclear-capable weapons were deployed to Korea as a consequence of a massive retaliation strategy. I want to highlight that was not the case. The nuclear-capable weapons, meaning Atomic Annie and Honest John rockets, were brought into Korea as the United States was moving away from massive retaliation strategy. So let me elaborate on that. Massive retaliation, it was geared towards the Soviet Union and China. Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket, these were only useful against North Korea and maybe Chinese forces if they intervened in the Korean War and they were in North Korea. Massive retaliation resorted to Air Force strategic bomber and strategic nuclear weapons. In contrast, Atomic Annie and Honest John were US Army tactical nuclear weapons. Massive retaliation was premised on a general all-out war, whereas Atomic Annie and Honest John were only useful in local or peripheral wars. So again, massive retaliation cannot explain why these two weapon systems were brought into Korea. And as a matter of fact, John Foster Dulles, the State Department Secretary, released an article in Foreign Affairs on April 1st, 1954, stressing that massive retaliation did not mean that if there is a communist attack somewhere in Asia, nuclear weapons will necessarily be dropped. So once again, massive retaliation cannot explain why nuclear-capable weapons were brought to South Korea. Now, I mentioned that the United States started to slowly move away from massive retaliation doctrine, and the catalyst was the increasing Soviet nuclear capability. As we all know, in 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonates a nuclear weapon. By 1953, the Soviet Union successfully detonates hydrogen bomb. Against this backdrop, guidelines under NSC 162/2 for fiscal year 1956 is adopted on August 7th, 1954. And here are some of the things that were stressed in this document. Number one, because of the increasing Soviet nuclear capability, Moscow is now able to deter Washington just the way Washington is able to deter Moscow. So the Soviet Union and the United States were reaching a state of mutual deterrence. That meant that the United States and Soviet Union would most likely not fight a general war. Instead, peripheral wars will become more important, and the greatest threat to the free world will be subversion, indirect aggression, and civil wars. And you can kind of infer from this that Korea and even Vietnam kind of fell into this category. Civil war, yeah. Subversion, indirect aggression, yeah. It's talking about Korea. Now, on January 7, 1955, NSC 5501 is adopted. And here it says that nuclear weapons could be used to respond to local aggression, provided that it did not develop into total nuclear war. Now, with that, I want to add this as well. the same document, NSC 5501, stressed that US nuclear air retaliatory power had to be kept secure from Soviet knockout blow. I think this is important because this explains why strategic nuclear weapons or US Air Force strategic bombers were not placed in Korea. South Korea directly bordered North Korea. It was close to China. It was close to Russia. If the United States ever deployed its strategic nuclear bomb or strategic bombers, they would be vulnerable to communist attack, and therefore it did not make sense to deploy strategic nuclear weapons or strategic bombers to South Korea. Now, the idea of not provoking a general war against the Soviet Union and Communist China were stressed multiple times. These are two examples. NSD 5602/1, adopted on March 15, 1956, said US should not provoke a general war with the Communist bloc. Again, on June 3, 1957, NSC 5707/8 is adopted. It says United States should not provoke a general war with the Communist bloc. Now, this idea of not provoking a war with the Communist bloc was especially pertinent to Korea, because even during the Korean War, NSC 81/1, NSC 48/5 were adopted respectively on September 11, 1950 and May 17, 1951. Both of these documents stress that the United States should avoid the general war with the Soviet bloc. Simply put, the Korean War should not develop into World War III. The same idea was stressed after the war. For example, if you look at NSC 5702/2, adopted on August 9, 1957, it says that the United States should not provoke Soviet Union's intervention. Basically, it should not provoke a general war with the Soviet bloc. And all this is to say that the United States was slowly moving away from massive retaliation. And as a matter of fact, John Foster Dulles on October 1st, 1957, released another article in Foreign Affairs, and it says, less reliance on vast mass retaliatory power. Basically, the United States was moving away from massive retaliation doctrine. And also, Eisenhower said this in one of the NSC meetings in early 1957. Small tactical nuclear weapons might be used in local situations. So to summarize, by 1957, or around the time nuclear-capable weapons were to be deployed to South Korea, the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons in local situations on the condition that this did not develop into a general war with the Soviet bloc emerged. And this provides a context against which nuclear-capable weapons would eventually be deployed to South Korea. Now, along with the transformation of US national-level nuclear weapons strategy, it is also important to examine how the US Army transformed itself, because if the US Army did not like nuclear weapons, there would be no reason to deploy Honest John rockets or Atomic Annie. But the Army during this time was transforming itself into a nuclear-capable force. And let me just elaborate on that a bit. So as we all know, Eisenhower administration's priority, or one of Eisenhower administration's priorities, was to save money, which meant reducing defense costs. Now, the Korean War experience was also important because during the Korean War, or as the Korean War became longer than people expected, a lot of Americans began to say, we are spending too much money in Korea. Too many people are dying in Korea. We do not want that. We do not want another Korean War type of conflict in the future. Now, what does this all lead to? Reduction of defense cost and not wanting Korean War type conflict meant more reliance on nuclear weapons and less reliance on maintaining big conventional force. And less reliance on maintaining big conventional force basically meant less money for the Army. The Army was obviously not happy about this. The Army criticized the massive retaliation doctrine, saying that it was too rigid It was based on mass destruction. A lot of people will be killed. If nuclear weapons were ever to be used, it had to be used selectively to minimize human casualty. And it also stressed that in future wars, you cannot just simply rely on nuclear weapons. Conventional force would continue to play a very important role. Now, having said that, the Army was not entirely against the use of nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, even before the Korean War, and even before Eisenhower administration, the US Army, I think it was June or May 1950, right before the outbreak of the Korean War, and announced that they were developing nuclear weapons. So again, the Army was not totally against the idea of nuclear weapons. It's just the manner of how nuclear weapons would be used. And I didn't write it here, but eventually the Army's ideas would culminate in flexible strategy. Going back to my point, the world had already entered the nuclear age. The Army had to come to terms with this. It had to incorporate nuclear weapons somehow to its force structure. And this leads to the Army's transformation. Its airborne armored infantry divisions will be transformed into nuclear-capable force, and that meant the United States ground forces, or the United States Army forces that were deployed to Korea at the time, would also be transformed into nuclear-capable pentomic divisions. Specifically, Army's 1st Cavalry Division and 7th Infantry Division would become nuclear-capable. And during this time, the Army's doctrine began to change. What you see here is Field Service Regulation, released in 1954. And this field manual basically said upfront that the United States Army, in the case of war, would use nuclear weapons to accomplish large-scale devastation or neutralization of the enemy. Now, this document, A Guide to Army Philosophy, was published in January 1958, which was around the time Atomic Annie and Honest John rockets were deployed to South Korea. And it talked about a lot of different things, but I want to stress the following four. First, the Army defined its top priority as deterrence, or if deterrence fails, it had to win local war quickly. And subversion and local aggression were the most serious threat to world peace, and Korea was one of the potential trouble spots. It actually said this. Korea is a place where US Army had to keep a very close eye on. And the Army would use nuclear weapons for deterrence, and if deterrence fails, it would use nuclear weapons as warfighting instrument. Now, this document is very interesting. This was written during the Korean War. At the height of Korean War, it's titled Tactical Employment of Atomic Weapons, and it said a lot of different things, but I want to highlight the following three. Number one, the Army would use nuclear weapons tactically if needed through artillery or missiles with a yield of less than 40 kilotons. The targets here would include enemy's troops, artillery, airfields, petroleum, oil, lubricants, bridges, tanks, armored cavalry, etc. Specifically in the case of Korea, targets would include Chinese Communist Force and North Korean Army, or Chinese Communist Force 66th Army Corps, an enemy supply route, etc. So the point that I want to make here is that the Army was willing to use nuclear weapons for counterforce purposes. And this is very different from strategic bombing. Now, to recap, the Army was being transformed into nuclear-capable force, which meant that US Army units in Korea had to be transformed into nuclear-capable units as well. And on top of that, the United States as a nation decided that tactical nuclear weapons could be used for local wars, provided that this did not provoke a general war against the Soviet Union and China. This provides a context against which Army's tactical nuclear weapons would be deployed to Korea. Now, as I said, my tentative conclusion is that Honest John rockets and Atomic Annie were appropriate for Korea. It was appropriate because it's only useful for battlefields, and it could not reach Pyongyang, it could not reach China or Russia. which means that it was very unlikely that use of these weapons would provoke a general war with China or the Soviet Union. So therefore, that explains why Atomic Annie and Honest John rockets might have been chosen to be deployed to Korea. But the question remains, why 1958 and not earlier? So this is a quick overview of what happened. I just want to highlight three things. The idea of deploying nuclear-capable weapons to Korea already emerged in January 1956. So U.S. Army Chief of Staff and Commander-in-Chief of United Nations Command proposed deploying Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket to Korea. But it was only by August 1957 that Eisenhower approved the deployment of Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket to Korea. And only by September 16, 1957, did the United States officially inform South Korean government that these weapons will be delivered to Korea. So how do you explain this gap? There was almost a year and a half delay between when the idea first emerged and when the idea actually became practice or reality. As I said, there were two reasons. One was that it took time for the United States to iron out its own differences. Second reason was that it took time for South Korea and the United States to work out their differences. So let me just elaborate on that a bit. Again, one of the priorities of the Eisenhower administration was saving money, and that meant reducing defense costs, and that meant reducing U.S. troop level in Korea. And as you can see here, that is why on December 26, 1953, Eisenhower announces that it would like to withdraw 2 U.S. divisions from Korea. Another thing is that the United States wanted to reduce military aid to Korea, which the United States had been providing since 1954 with the coming into effect of South Korea-America alliance. Now, reducing military aid to Korea meant reducing U.S. troop level because the South Korean military at this time was being supported with American dollars. So the problem here was that, yeah, reducing U.S. troops in Korea and reducing South Korean troops would definitely save money, but it's gonna create a military imbalance in relation to the communists in North Korea. I'm going to skip that. Now, military imbalance, what do I mean? So, as we all know, 28 July 1953, active hostilities come to an end in Korea with the signing of the Armistice Agreement. Armistice Agreement 13-D said this. It's long, so I'm going to break it down into the following 3 points. Armistice Agreement 13-D said no new weapons could be introduced into Korea. You are welcome to replace existing weapons as long as it is the same model, but no new weapons. And neutral nations inspection team composed of Poland and Czechoslovakia representing the communist bloc, Switzerland and Sweden representing the United Nations bloc, would oversee and make sure that nobody's breaking this rule. The problem is that the United Nations discovered that North Korea was breaking the rules. So as you can see here, there were these kinds of weapons and this many weapons when the Armistice Agreement was signed. By June 1955, there were this much increases for these weapons. By March 1957, what was really concerning is that you have increases in the existing weapons, but you also have weapons that were not existent when the armistice was signed. You have 40mm rocket launcher and 82mm rocket launcher, which did not exist when the armistice was signed. By March 1957, you had over 4,000 of these. So, to summarize, the United States was trying to reduce US troops in Korea. It was trying to reduce South Korean troops in Korea. It was trying its best not to violate Armistice 13-D. In contrast, North Korea was violating Armistice Agreement 13-D, and this was creating a potential military imbalance between the United Nations forces and the communists. So, what should be done? General Taylor, the US Army Chief of Staff, said, why not introduce Atomic Annie to Korea? Similarly, General Lemnitzer, who was the Chief Commander of United Nations Command, said, we should suspend Armistice Agreement 13-D and deploy Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket to Korea. Admiral Radford, who was the JCS chairman, said that the United States forces in Korea should be transformed into nuclear-capable forces before reducing US and South Korean troops. Similarly, the US Embassy in Seoul said that, yeah, sure, you can reduce South Korean troop level, but this had to be accompanied by the introduction of nuclear-capable weapons such as Honest John. Now, that was a military stance and the US Embassy in Korea stance. The State Department overall, however, was against it. So again, the US military was saying, we need to address this military imbalance vis-a-vis communists. Placing nuclear weapons in Korea would help us save money and reassure our ally, and also allow us to modernize US forces in Korea into nuclear-capable forces. State Department said, well, it's not going to look good if we violate Armistice Agreement 13-D. But more concerning was this. While the United States nuked the Japanese, we nuked the Asians before. And if we place nuclear weapons in Korea, that means that we are willing to use nuclear weapons against Asians again. That's not going to look good. Indians and the Japanese would especially not like this. The United States might be kicked out of the region, which is not good for US strategy. And obviously, this is mostly coming from John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State. And this is something that everybody knows, so I'm just going to go over very quickly. So, nuclear bombing of Hiroshima. It had military and industrial targets, but you also have a lot of civilian targets. And according to official figure, the total casualty rate was between 100,000 to 180,000. In the case of Nagasaki, something similar. You destroyed a lot of military industrial buildings, but you also destroyed a lot of civilian buildings and killed a lot of civilians. According to official figure, total casualty rate was between 50,000 and 100,000. And this became a trauma for John Foster Dulles as well as others. I forgot the name of the person, but some of the other top State Department figures also brought up this issue of race and the idea that if nuclear weapons were ever deployed or used in Asia, that's not going to look good. So let me just quickly summarize the conversation between the State Department and the Pentagon and how it was eventually resolved. So again, the US military was saying, there's a military imbalance in Korea, we need to do something about it. The State Department suggested introducing new conventional weapons. In response, Pentagon said, well, even if we bring in new conventional weapons, that's going to violate Armistice 13-D. Might as well just bring in nuclear-capable weapons. State Department said, well, do we have enough evidence to prove that the communists are actually violating 13-D? Can we convince our friends? And then the military said, well, we can work together and work that out. John Foster Dulles really did not like the idea of deploying Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket to Korea, so he suggested continuing to rely on strategic nuclear capability, or what many people these days call extended deterrence. But the Pentagon said, well, you know that allies, including Korea, do not really believe in extended deterrence. Also, if the war actually does resume again in Korea, sure, you can use strategic weapons coming from Guam or Okinawa, but the bombs would arrive there after the US ground forces are run over by the communists. Again, State Department was concerned about adverse reaction from allies and friends, and Pentagon says, well, we already talked to a lot of our friends. Many of them seem to be okay with it. The only issue that they have is the possibility that nuclear-capable weapons will be given to South Korea. And the Pentagon assured these countries, Australia, Britain, Canada, France, New Zealand, Thailand, Turkey, and even Japan, that nuclear-capable weapons would not be given to South Korea. And I think this is important. I think eventually the State Department was convinced because Pentagon stressed that nuclear weapons would help. Deploying nuclear-capable weapons to Korea would help the United States save money. So again, to summarize, by 13 June 1957, Eisenhower says, okay, the communists are violating the armistice. Well, we're not going to adhere to the armistice either. We will just modernize US forces in Korea into a nuclear-capable unit. And by June 21st, the UN representative for Military Armistice Commission informs his communist counterpart that the United Nations would be relieved from Armistice 13-D, meaning we will no longer adhere to Armistice 13-D. And as I said earlier, by September 16th, 1957, the United States officially informs the South Korean government that Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket will enter Korea on the condition that ROK troops are reduced. This might be interesting to you, but that's the actual document. The one highlighted in red says that the United Nations would be relieved from the obligations under Armistice 13-D. Now, that's how the United States resolved its internal difference. Now, the question was, how do you work out the difference with South Korea? As I said, on September 1957, the United States informed South Korea that they will deploy nuclear-capable weapons on the condition that South Korea reduce its troop level. South Korea said, okay, we will reduce 60,000 people from 720,000 people. The United States in response said, wait a minute, 720,000 people, that's a nominal figure on paper. Your actual combat troop level is 676,995. You should reduce 60,000 men from this figure. Or alternatively, you can reduce 100,000 people from the nominal figure of 720,000 figure. Now, eventually, they would not reach agreement until February 1958. What is interesting is that as the United States and South Korea continue to argue about the scope of troop reduction for South Korean troops, Pentagon on December 24, 1957, already approved the deployment of Atomic Annie and Honest John to Korea. And 2 days after 26 December, Atomic Annie and Honest John units in Japan and Okinawa were ordered to move to Korea. And by 29 January 1958, United Nations Command announced that Atomic Annie and Honest John have been stationed in Korea. And the agreement on the scope of ROK troop reduction would only be reached in February 1958. Now, one thing that you might want to remember is that the South Korean troop reduction was a serious issue. It did contribute to the delay. It might not have been a determining factor, meaning the United States was still willing to deploy nuclear-capable weapons before they reached an agreement on the scope of South Korean troop reduction. But the very fact that the United States and South Korea were talking about troop reduction was a contributing factor to the delay or the timing of Atomic Annie and Honest John to Korea. And by January 31, 1958, you see here 100th Field Artillery Battalion, which is the Honest John Rocket Battalion, 663rd Field Artillery Battalion, which is Atomic Annie Battalion, became part of I Corps group, which was in Korea. Again, Atomic Annie and Honest John by late January 1958 was placed in Korea. So to recap, why Atomic Annie and Honest John rocket? Because they were appropriate for Korea. They were useful battlefield tactical nuclear capable weapons that would not provoke, or most likely not provoke, a general war with the Soviet bloc. Why January 1958? Number one, because it took time for the Defense Department and the State Department to iron out their differences. And secondly, it took time for South Korea and the United States to work things out over the question of how much troops should be reduced. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation. I'm timing myself. I think I still have 5 more minutes. If it is okay, is it okay if I show you the actual archives that I used?
Sure, yes, please.
Okay. So allow me to screen share again. Can everybody see the screen? Okay.
Yes.
So the first archive is called the National Institute for Korean History. As I said, what this institute does is that it copies Korea-related documents from the National Archives and Records Administration and digitizes them and makes them available online. So this is a government-run website. So you only have Korean. We do have English Mirror, but it's not like fully like how should I say it? It's not fully organized. So you'll have to use Korean website. But anyway, so if you access this website, you have this thing called 전자사료관, which is basically digital archives. You go here, and let's say, for example, I want to look up tactical employment of atomic weapons. So that's the document. If you click that, you can actually see the original document that they copied. So this is how I did my research. So that's one archive that I used. Another archive that I use is the South Korean National Library. Again, this has both Korean and English Mirror, but English Mirror, I think they're still working on it, so you will have to resort to the Korean website. Basically, this is how it works. If you go to the main website and go to this thing called collection, there's a section called digital collection here. And under digital collection, there's this thing called overseas archives related to Korea. If you click that, then as you can see, they have archives that they copied from National Archives and Records Administration, CIA, from CIS country, etc. I used the one that was collected from NARA, National Archives and Records Administration. Now, if you click this, it shows like what kinds of documents have been collected. And if you click this, that actually will show you the records. So for example, one of the things that I used is RG 550 records of United States Army Pacific. Let's see, where was it? I believe it was this. And I believe it was, I'm sorry, maybe that's not it. No, that's not it. Where was it? One,
I
two,
think
three.
it's okay. We know how it works, so
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, I
Doesn't
found
matter.
it.
Yeah.
Would you mind
Yeah.
giving me like, yeah,
Mhm.
just 1 minute? So yeah, this is one of the documents that I used. Remember the last document on that showed the organizational file? Organizational file that showed which unit the Honest John Rocket Battalion and Atomic Annie Battalion belonged. This is where I found it. So yeah, these are the main documents and archives that I use for my research. And again, like you had to know a bit of Korean. And if you don't know, if you use Google Translate, you can kind of you can kind of like navigate your through. So yeah. So I am going to end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to your questions and advice.
Okay, thank you so much. That was absolutely informative. And since I studied the same period, West Germany, and I'm also interested in what was happening in Okinawa during the same period. I have a lot of questions myself, but we'll first go to Harry Lee for his comments and questions. So, Harry.
Okay. Could you hear me? Okay. Hello, Dr. Gang. So my name's Harry. I'm a PhD student at the Waseda University. Um, and I'm a political science major. I'm also researching for my dissertation on US allies' nuclear policy in Asia and Europe during the Cold War. So this was, of course, a very fascinating presentation for me to listen to. It's a very interesting historical topic, and a topic that has much relevance to security developments in Asia today. So I have two sort of sets of comments and questions related to your research itself, and also related to the implications of your research on today's security issues. So first, on your research, what I found to be interesting was how the US's general sort of nuclear policy, like massive retaliation or flexible response, actually had very different sort of local applications due to the different local threat environment, for instance, in Korea, as you argue. Um, so reducing conventional forces and bringing tactical nuclear weapons into Korea ostensibly seemed like it had origins in the logic of massive retaliation, but the logic of these decisions were different from Europe, and perhaps they were, as you sort of hinted, were closer to flexible response in its strategic logic. Um, and then most importantly, the US demonstrated great reluctance on deploying or using strategic weapons in Korea. Instead, it preferred to rely on tactical weapons. And the logic, which is unique to Korea's situation, as you argue, was that they needed to address the military imbalance on Korea that resulted from reducing US conventional forces there. And then the second, the strategic weapons would be basically useless for defending a North Korean conventional attack, a point that South Korea agreed on, as you seem to suggest in the presentation, but also that deploying strategic weapons would be vulnerable, would make them vulnerable or provocative to China and the Soviet Union. And so, from this perspective, US deterrence posture removed from sort of national nuclear policy was kind of tailored to the particular threat environment in Korea. So I'd just like to sort of unpack your research a little regarding the similarities and the differences between general US nuclear policy and the policy that was adopted in Korea, as this is a key sort of claim that you make. So with massive retaliation, still, the one aspect of massive retaliation that seemed similar to US policy in Korea was the reduction of conventional forces and the reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. Although, of course, the US was not going to use or deploy strategic weapons. And so that would be a difference, but also there are these similarities. And so were you able to find whether the decision, for instance, to reduce conventional troops in Korea followed the massive retaliation concept, or was it that the US was just less willing to spend money in a place like Korea, which at the time was strategically less important, for instance, compared to Europe? And then I wanted to get to sort of potential similarities and differences with flexible response. So how is US posture different from flexible response in Korea? According to your argument, it seemed to me that so strategic weapons were seen as unusable, not because of nuclear stalemate, as in Europe, since North Korea was a non-nuclear power, but because it was seen as inadequate for deterring or defending a conventional attack. Um, and that, of course, that it was either vulnerable to a Chinese or Soviet attack, or that it was too provocative. So would this be the sort of the main difference from flexible response? But at the same time, unlike flexible response, which sort of emphasized actually the importance of conventional forces, the US still wanted to reduce conventional forces in Korea. So overall, it seemed to me that the posture had some elements of massive retaliation and also some elements of flexible response. But you would argue that the logic of the US posture in Korea was much more to do with the US assessment of the particular threat environment in Korea, rather than having any relationship with sort of general nuclear strategy concepts. And then the second question I had was, so if you put all of this together, what would it say? What does your research say about the US's extended deterrence posture in Korea? Should we characterize it as one which mainly emphasizes deterrence by denial, without punishment, with conventional forces, equipped with tactical nuclear weapons, and that and the U.S. posture in Korea included little role for strategic weapons, even as deterrence posture. And then perhaps this is maybe beyond the scope of your research, but I was wondering whether you were able to look at South Korea's response to US decision to bring in tactical nuclear weapons. Was South Korea happy with them? Or were they worried that it may provoke China or Russia? You mentioned, I think, at some point that South Korea was not convinced by the utility of strategic weapons for the situation in Korea. In a previous event of this series, we had a presentation on Italy's thinking on hosting similar tactical weapons. And the presenter, Professor Nutti from Roma Tre University, he argued that, for instance, that Italy believed that it didn't really need the tactical nuclear weapons for its defense purposes, that it was actually doing a favor to the US by hosting them, and that it sort of saw it as a means of gaining more influence in the NATO strategy making process. So I was wondering how South Korea's thinking was different. Clearly, it was under a slightly different threat environment compared to Italy. And then finally, of course, the implications for today. What implication do you think your arguments have on the present situation on the Korean Peninsula, where we have the advancement of North Korea's nuclear weapons, including ICBMs and tactical nuclear weapons, and also recently, given the ongoing demands from the US on allowing US forces in Korea to participate in Taiwan contingency, and the potential deterrence gap this might create on the Korean Peninsula. So I'll just add my questions in the comments there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comments and questions. Many of the questions that you raised are the very questions that I still have and not been able to answer yet. Hopefully, I will be able to find the answer sooner than later. Let me start with the easy question. Question number 4. What was South Korea? How did the South Koreans like the idea of having tactical nuclear weapons in Korea? The leaders, yes. It was the president, Ri Seung-man. He since the Korean War had been suggesting the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. And in 1957, I believe there was I forgot the name of the newspaper, but one of the foreign journalists asked Ri Seung-man if he would be okay having U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. He used the word, "I would be happy happy to discuss them with our deputies. So the president was definitely not against it. I think he welcomed the idea of placing tactical nuclear weapons in Korea. Same thing with the top military guys. I believe the chief of staff of the army talked before the press 3 times on the need to deploy nuclear capable weapons to Korea. Sadly, I was not able to find anything more. So my tentative conclusion is that the South Korean leadership was definitely okay and even welcomed it. The general public, I have not been able to find yet any instances where anybody expressed anti-nuclear sentiment. I was not able to find it. So it seems like in general, South Koreans were either okay or even like welcomed placing these nuclear capable weapons in Korea. What can we say about the extended deterrence posture in Korea? What's interesting is extended deterrence did not go away. If you look at the war plans for the Far East, you can definitely see that extended deterrence was there. Because the idea that if there is a war in Korea, strategic bombers would fly from Guam and Okinawa was actually mentioned. So extended deterrence was there. What is interesting is that in addition to having extended deterrence, US Army tactical nuclear weapons were also placed in South Korea, which is interesting because, as I said, today, United States just wants to have extended deterrence, just rely on air power, and I don't think they are too keen on deploying tactical nuclear weapons to Korea, at least not yet. There have been talks about it. I think Senator Wick actually brought it up a couple of months ago on the need to redeploy US tactical nuclear weapons to Korea. Certain segments of South Korea have also been talking about redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons in Korea in lieu of developing our own nuclear capability. So extended deterrence was there in the 1950s. I believe it is still there because that's what you see in the official statements. About deterrence by denial, I'm sorry, like I don't know much about political science concepts, so I don't think I can answer that. But hopefully, what I just told you will be helpful somewhat to your research. About flexible response, this is really interesting. I think the answer to this question really depends on how you understand and define flexible response and how you understand mass retaliation. My understanding is that the United States leadership as a whole was moving away from mass retaliation towards flexible response, without actually naming it flexible response. As we know, the Kennedy administration actually used the word flexible response, but the concept itself was already existent. And as I kind of mentioned, the US Army kind of led the way. So in the case of South Korea, I would argue that flexible response was actually already applied even before Kennedy administration. Because the US Army's idea it was that you cannot just solely rely on nuclear weapons. You need both conventional forces as an option. As a matter of fact, that should be your first option. Because if you don't have that option, that means you're just going to use nuclear weapons right away. That's going to cause mass destruction. Things are going to escalate very quickly, and things will look very ugly. So the way I see it is that Korea was probably, I wouldn't say first instant because tactical nuclear weapons were already deployed to Europe before South Korea. But South Korea is a case example of where the US Army was able to apply the idea of flexible response, even before the word flexible response was being used. Did I find evidence on, oh, we just want to save money? Well, yes and no. Yes, because I did come across several through the Foreign Relations of the United States series that kind of hinted at this, but that was it. I was not able to find anything else. If I do, I will let you know. But I must say that this research is still very much a work in progress, and I cannot really say things are like conclusive or that my conclusion are definitive. If they are, great, but again, it might not be. Your last question, what can I say about the president? About the present? Yeah, I'm gonna, like use my historian card. I'm not good with predicting the present or analyzing the present or the future. Um, but my personal opinion is that it's actually not just my opinion. This is what a lot of experts say. If the United States decides to leave Korea, then we definitely need nuclear weapons. How else are we going to how else are we going to defend ourselves? Thankfully, there are only talks about reducing it. They didn't. I don't think. Despite Trump's rhetoric, I don't think the United States is serious about abandoning Korea outright. Which means that I don't think we've reached that level where we need to start developing nuclear weapons. Deployment of tactical nuclear weapons will be great, except as far as I understand, the United States in its inventory don't have enough to spare any nuclear weapons for South Korea. And I think this is an ongoing issue right now. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States have been drastically reducing its nuclear warheads. And right now, you are seeing the price of it. There isn't much that the United States can do. And one example is that even if the United States talk about possibly deploying tactical nuclear weapons back to South Korea, they don't have it. So I don't think I was able to answer all of your question because again, I'm still like this research is still ongoing, but hopefully that I answered some of them and hopefully it was helpful.
Hey, thank you. So we will go on to Q&A session, but are you okay with just going on, or should we just take a 5-minute break?
I think I'm okay. Yeah, I would just
Okay, good.
keep going.
Right. So we already see hands up, but I'm going to take the chairman's privilege to ask my own questions first. My gut feeling is that you're going to find a lot more if you dig into Okinawa, because I think there were already nuclear weapons brought into Okinawa. Okinawa is under military administration at this time. I think there's evidence that they were bringing in already around 55. And I mean, naturally, I think they would think that they can control the things better in Okinawa than in Korea. All right. And the reason why it was the army nuclear weapons and not the Air Force is probably that they could keep it in Okinawa. I mean, Kadena is a fabulous airway. So Navy, Navy, Air Force probably had no problem at all keeping them in Okinawa in the late 50s, 60s. Whereas, of course, Army with its Pentamic Division idea had to have it more closer to the front line. And since these didn't fly much, the more the reason to have it on front line. So I think there, if you sort of look for the connection there, you would probably find a logic, I think. And I mean, that would bring us to the entire battle plan of the US forces Korea, how they were planning to fight a reunited Korean battle in those days. My question would be that, they have to give up Okinawa in 1970, 1973, with all the nuclear weapons gone. Did that affect what was on the Korean Peninsula itself?
Thank you. I'm sorry to disappoint you. So I'm just beginning to look into 1970s. I have not been able to find any. My guess is that it probably did impact Korea, because Japan security between Japan and Korea are so interconnected. If something happens in Korea, that's definitely going to affect Japan. If something happens in Japan, it's definitely going to impact Korea. So again, yeah, from my gut feeling tells me that there should be something. I have not been able to find a lot of evidence. And as a matter of fact, I actually want to open up this question to the floor. Like, if you can suggest any sort of records or even secondary sources, I would really appreciate it. Because one thing that I learned while doing this research is that it's very difficult to find records. Even if I find records, like it's very heavily sanitized or they are withdrawn. And I contacted the National Archives and Records Administration, and it's taking them a long time for them to get back to me. So yeah, thank you for the question. Again, this is one of the questions that I have that I have not been able to tackle yet. Hopefully I will find something sooner than later.